Well, kia ora and welcome to another episode of Passing the Torch. I'm very honoured today to be joined by Dame Catherine Healy, so thank you very much, Dame Catherine, for joining us today. So I'll just start. If you could just give me a brief introduction in your own words of who you are.
Oh, kia ora, Connor. It's an honour to be interviewed, and thank you for taking the trouble. I'm here at this hui, which marks 20 years since sex work was mostly decriminalised, and I say that because we qualify it. We haven't quite decriminalised everything, but I grew up in Wellington, and I went to university, went to teachers college, became a teacher and then a sex worker, and I had the privilege and honour of being involved in establishing our organisation and being a part of the sex worker rights movement. So this is reflecting really 1986 when I became a sex worker, in 1987 when we established NZPC.
Yeah, cool. So, you know, your childhood, your adolescence, when you think about like that time of your life, what comes to mind? Like, what was your environment growing up?
Well, I went to a state secondary and a Catholic primary school, and you know, I'd say the environment was really liberal. The times in 1970, when I was 14, the produce movement was well underway. There were movements against apartheid,
yes.
and I certainly went on marches when I was old enough, and lots of anti-nuclear topics were being discussed, feminism, all of this. So it was kind of rich, and also abortion rights were really significant at that time and still are.
Yes, yes. So you talk about those tour protests, especially obviously with the Springbok tour. What was it like to be at those protests and in that environment?
Well, it was, you know, you felt for a start this international connection, you know, to a country far away, and that you could do your little bit to be a part of that and express your disdain for something so abhorrent. And of course, you know, a lot of your friends, my friends, were part of and my family actually, part of the anti-apartheid organising as well. And so, it felt good to be a part of that.
Absolutely. And do you think anything you learned at those protests would like influence you later on? Like, obviously, it really got politicians listening, those protests. It was a big controversy at the time. Did you learn any like lessons that maybe helped later on?
I think that you can make a change, but I don't think anything resonated. You know, I felt very much, you know, I was very quiet, quietly participating, one of the crowd as opposed to one of the leaders. So, you know, I was very inspired by the activism that occurred, of course. You know, like there was great activism and debate, and people pushed hard. And of course it was in the generation when there was limited news media. It was coming down to us through one or two means, you know, not 1,001 means, you know, as we can now. And so organising was very intimate, very, you know, you had to belong, be a part of something, almost.
So how did you first become involved in sex work?
Well, a couple of stories really. I didn't recognise people as sex workers. I must have flattered with quite a lot of people in my youth, and I know that I came across sex workers in that context, but I didn't realise it at the time necessarily. When I did have a flatmate who was clearly bringing people back to our flat, I was absolutely aghast and trying to rescue this person, and she said, well, who are you? How do you know? And in fact, I did a little bit of sex work at that time. She was a street-based sex worker, but I left it, you know, I can't say I had lived experience as a street-based sex worker out of the limited experience I had at that time. But later on, when I come to you know, 10:30, I was looking to make advances in my life, and I travel, spend all my savings, come back and work teaching for another year, and I thought I've got to speed this up and I need a nighttime job. So it could have been bar work, it could have been anything to supplement my teaching, but in actual fact, worldly me answered an advert, didn't realise it was a code for a brothel. Went into a massage parlour and was hired as a gormless receptionist at first. Then I did what they said back then, I jumped the desk and became a sex worker. So it was all very illegal.
Of course. Yeah, so what was the sex work scene like back in Wellington back then?
Lots of massage parlours with neon signs in the sky, and very reliant on foot traffic. So genuinely people would present with $30 and book half an hour of a massage expecting there to be a massage. And of course the women, generally cisgendered women worked in that space, weren't there to massage because no income was to be earned from massaging. So, you know, it was a shock and very interesting, and kind of this presentation of normality, really. It felt welcoming, very diverse kinds of people who left school at a young age, people who were supplementing postgraduate study, you know, all of this. Yeah,
and I mean, I think it's fair to say there's quite a negative public perception of what sex work is like from like the movies and stuff, you know, it's all shady, underworld type stuff. I mean, was there ever any of that sort of thing? You know, was there ever like danger? Did you feel in danger from like gangs, clients, police?
Police.
Yes.
All of, you know, the other two you mentioned, gangs and, you know, like the idea of organised crime, no. It wasn't that kind of operation at all. And I know the perception was of that. And of course there were people who came in and had rich lives in you know, a variety of different ways. So some people did have friends, some people did live with gangs or had gang whānau, and you know, it wasn't that the sex industry was run by people like that, whatever that meant. Yeah. I mean, what I found in Wellington, that most of the places were run by women who were quite once again quite diverse. So.
But you said from the police you felt.
Yeah, the police were a mixed bag, and so they had the right under the Massage Parlours Act of 1978, which was designed to contain and control us all. Herded us into these licensed venues, of which there were quite a few. And then the police had the right of access to come and pick any of our names up and record them on a police database of known prostitutes. So that was kind of their legal bridge into this world, and they would come in and sit down and say, "How are you girls?" You know, just joking. If any of us hung about in the lounge, the public lounge, to talk with them, and then they'd shuffle out, and then, you know, like they would occasionally do entrapment exercises where they'd come in pretending to be clients, and they'd book a massage, and they'd entrap you, and about a week or so later they'd come back and some poor person would be hauled out and told that they'd solicited, which was the exercise of asking for money for sex in a public place. Now these were considered public places. Darkened rooms. Doors closed, public places.
So when did you first sort of think, you know, okay, we need like a collective or a union? Was there like a moment that you thought?
I did think that, but I also think I was working with people who also thought that and educated me. And there had been an earlier attempt at the beginning of the 80s that I had heard these stories about, you know, how they'd had their tyres slashed by the bad pumps, you know, this kind of stuff, which I never got to the bottom of it, and never met the person who had their tyres supposedly slashed. So there was a bit of a rumour mill about what happened to people who had tried to unionise, and we started to meet and talk casually in a kind of informal way that we needed to get organised. We had HIV coming, and we were being spoken about a lot, and nobody had a voice to speak and contradict some of the stories.
Yeah. So when you guys started out, what was sort of the goal for the collective?
Well, you know, we didn't sit down with a big bit of butcher paper and have a strategic plan. It just kind of came together in a semi-informal way. Like, so we sat in a flat, 9 of us to start with, I think, and talked about, you know, what we would like to do. We wanted a magazine, we wanted community drop-in places, we wanted the police to stop hassling, we wanted the law to change. You know, that seemed beyond us. You know, that was like a wild fantasy that the law could change. And we imagined every sex worker in the globe had it better than us. You know, that there was more progressive stuff, and we were, you know, trying to catch up with people. Yeah. So, yeah, and then we intersected with health, of course.
Right. Yeah.
That boosted us enormously because we entered into a formal contract.
Absolutely. So you mentioned about it obviously coincided with the HIV pandemic.
Yeah.
What was the effect of that like on the community here?
Right. Well, you know, it really was a showstopper at times. You know, like clients would come in and say, "You're skinny. You must have AIDS."
Right.
And so we had a kind of economic reality shock, and we realised that, you know, the idea that sex workers were going to be the vectors of transmission of HIV was in most people's minds, and it was really of concern. I mean, by then, you know, like we're talking 1986, 87, we knew how HIV was transmitted, but not necessarily, our clients didn't necessarily know, and we couldn't do overt promotion because any of that stuff, you know, that we would use, like talking frankly about transmission of HIV in a place that was pretending to be a massage parlour, would you know, was really quite hard. So our resources that we eventually developed, you know, like they were given, and people would be very worried about having them on site at their venues because they would contribute to evidence to achieve convictions.
When you formed the collective, what was the reaction like from, you know, people who weren't in the industry? I mean, was it just pushback, or did you find some allies out there?
We found allies. I think, you know, we lucked in with the women's organisations, our mates in public health, like you know, the people who are combating and supporting people who are living with HIV, and the needle exchange movement. Government had just funded the first countrywide national needle exchange program in the world, which was pretty historic for the time. So our government at the time was pretty responsive to HIV, and we lucked in that respect, and we built those relationships, and people wanted us to be a part of, you know, different networks, and that has sustained to this day, which is really lucky. Yeah,
absolutely. Obviously, from the time you guys formed to decriminalisation, when that passed, was a long struggle. Did you ever, you know, get burnt out or have mental health, you know, think, oh, this is not going to come to anything, you know, in the end, you know, we're not going to get there?
We entered a year after we formed, and at first I would have to say we were an informal network, not a formal organisation. And a year after we formed, we did sign a contract with government, and I signed that contract, and we set up a bank account, and they put the money in for our organisation to carry out its own educative response to HIV. And you know, we had to advocate on our own behalf to the police, though. We had to explain ourselves, and I think we didn't really have an appreciation of that. I think we thought government agencies talk to other government agencies.
Right, yeah.
So we were kind of lurching around with this reality of still being vulnerable to criminalisation and or being arrested, actually, personally, and some people, you know, our peers, and thinking, what's this, you know, like, so we got to a point, it was about 92, I think, when we said, actually, government, we need to talk about our reality and look at this legislation, or you can take the funding back and we will go underground again. You know, we're out of here, because they needed to get serious. You know, was it that they wanted this enforcement, or did they want this health promotion? Yeah. And the two couldn't just be, you know, be together without that friction. Yeah. You weren't getting any of the benefits from that relationship. No. Yeah. Fair enough. So what kept you going, I guess? You know, was like, how did you? Well, I think at first I often say to people, like, I'm so glad we didn't know what was ahead, that we didn't have a strategic plan and all that stuff, you know, to kind of intimidate, you know, like you see the templates that people come up with, and I think, oh my gosh, it exhausts me to think about it. But what kept us going was our personal involvement, I think, you know, like we were all personally involved in sex work and, you know, effecting change, and we started to engage with, you know, not only the NGO sector, the non-governmental organisations, but also the formal sectors and the political stuff that we had to, you know, the politicians we had to engage with to say, look, help us, please help us. We've got this struggle happening, and we need the law changed. And that became a kind of let's pursue this. And I mean, all the lobbying that you guys did with the government over that time, I mean, it seems to a lot of people in the public, government can be very, you know, opaque and impenetrable from the outside. Did you pick up ways to, like, make the politicians sit up and pay attention to you? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I you know, look, it did take us a long time, and you know, I remember going in with into a setting with there were some National Party ministers, and I was there with women who are heads of other organisations, and they just did not stand for that sort of smirk, oh, let's talk about this, shall we? Kind of culture. And you know, I did pick up, okay, be serious in the moment. You know, but people like to engage, and you've got to be approachable, but at the same time you are serious. You're not gonna. You got to stand your ground. You've got to stand your ground. Absolutely. And you know, like, that's not good enough, sort of. Yeah. When the private members bill got drawn eventually in 2003. Straight away. Yeah. What was the reaction like at the collective? Well, yeah. I mean, it quite literally the week before we'd been there and seen it go into the biscuit tin. Yeah. And then it was pulled out, and I think at the time there were 33 bills floating around. Someone did say to me, another member of Parliament did say, actually, some of the other bills came out so yours could be picked. I don't know if that was the case or not. Sounds like a good story. Yes. It could be true. Yeah, you never know. I might have misheard it, but I'm sure that's what was said. And I mean, it wasn't expected to pass, the bill, when it came up. Well, interesting you should say that, because I would have said otherwise, because I think, you know, like, it was, in the first reading, I think it was something like 87. Oh, it was quite a high number. And then, you know, because, you know, like, people didn't like the stories of the fact that the police were taking condoms from sex workers. They didn't like the gender imbalance, the fact that, you know, mostly cisgendered women were the ones who had been arrested along with whakawahine, and they didn't like the fact that the blokes could pay for sex.
Yeah.
And, you know, so they didn't, it was very simple to describe what was wrong, and I think there was a lot of support. The more sophisticated counter arguments didn't come out until they started to come out gradually, like more sophisticated.
Right.
Like, do we really want to recognise sex work? You know, this will mean that all these children will grow up aspiring to be.
Yeah, there was an argument it would increase sex workers. Yeah.
It was more of everything, more, you know, the idea that there would be more STIs, more gangs, more organised crime, more, you know, the opposition who are fundamentalists posing as a research institute, they were the main body. They just had to put more in front of everything, and people would believe they had no evidence. They were just making stuff.
I think in the end on the third reading it was 60 to 59. I think.
Yes, that's right. It was really close.
Yeah, and I mean, I've read a lot of people who have said or speculated that Georgina Bayer's speech changed a few minds last minute and allowed the bill to pass. Would you agree with that?
And Georgina made a really strong bill, speech, but also Winnie Laban, you know, like Winnie, and there were just different things appealed to different people. And you know, if I reflect on those politicians, Georgina wavered at one point, and we had to really work Georgina. You know, we had to work her back again. And oddly enough, after the fact, she kind of wavered again a little bit. Yeah, which, you know, she wavered on the notion of street-based sex work.
Right.
And so some community groups post-decriminalisation were kicking up a fuss about people working outside, being noisy in shopping centres in South Auckland.
Right.
And so there was a public meeting organised by Family First.
Yes.
And Georgina flew in for that on their coin. You know, so we had to, you know, that was the reality. We had to keep making sure people were up to speed. And of course, Georgina would stand with us in spaces after that.
Yes.
And recognise the importance of that law. But even someone with so much lived experience as Georgina had, it was hard to counteract some of the academic arguments the radical feminists from America put up. For example, if you weren't 100% familiar with some of the counterbalancing arguments in academia.
So you guys sort of had to go around like the party whip and be like, are you still on board?
Thank
Are
you.
you still on board?
Well, I mean, you know, like certainly Tim had his long lists of, you know, who was floating around, but yeah, I mean, we just couldn't, I couldn't personally fathom if we lost, you know, I couldn't have, sitting on edge in the gallery on the final reading that night, someone poked me in the back from the unions and said, never mind, Catherine, you know, we could still do good stuff.
Oh, right.
More or less implying we were going to live.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no, we couldn't.
Yeah.
Cannot happen.
Yeah.
There's only one.
You just couldn't even think about it. Yeah.
Couldn't think about it.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Aotearoa was the first country in the world to decriminalise sex work. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
What was it like then subsequently getting that sort of attention from around the globe on the collective and the bill?
Well, it was really weird, you know, like our first morning, and we were part of a network of sex work projects, and quite a shy group really in comparison, and you know, we were dealing with our own stuff domestically, and it wasn't that we were in splendid isolation all the time, but pretty much, you know, we were overshadowed by lots of other exotic countries like Australia, with their, you know, their confidence. And so our peer group didn't really find out what had happened. I remember there'd been some little change in Taiwan, which was quite significant for the sex workers there, but it was like, in comparison to what had happened to us, I was thinking, what's wrong with this picture? How come our peers don't get what's happened here? And because it was such a momentous change for us. So gradually the story got out and research kicked in, and we're deeply upset at some things that sit inside that law that we wouldn't say it qualifies. You can't say we've fully decriminalised. There's horrible stuff in there that we had to compromise on.
And I mean, within the sex work industry, how would you compare, when you sort of started out to now in terms of what life is like for the workers?
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been kind of the 20-year anniversary that we've been marking at this point, and it's people have different issues. Some of them are the same, some of them have changed markedly. I mean, we didn't have online advertising options when the law changed. It was, you had to sign up to the police. The police would approve, they said it wasn't approval, it was just they were gathering our name for our own protection. Before we could put our advertisements in the newspapers, which were carrying all our, the massage columns were like, that was our online space, if you like. People would read and see our phone numbers. And, we didn't know as private workers, if we were private workers, if we would be shut down, because, they had almighty power over our lives. So the fact that we could be in court and charged, named and shamed, all of the consequences of that. So no, they don't have to have any of that, but they can still be outed. They don't get the legal penalty, but they can be outed, and that's horrific for some people. They have a lot of options in terms of places where they can work if they can afford to set up and work collaboratively. There's room rental kind of cooperatives, which I think are fantastically supportive of sex workers. And then we still have the managed brothels, we still have the situations that can occur there where people are fired, contracts are terminated. But I think in the main, certainly research says this, that people are much better off. I put the much there.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously you mentioned before, we're not fully decriminalised. So what's the sort of next step that we'd like to see?
Repeal the odious Section 19, which prohibits people coming to this country with the intention of being sex workers. That's odious. And for those people who arrive in this country and become sex workers and who are still on a work visa, who are allowed to work in all other avenues of work, bar sex work, let's just sort that one out, because that's not good. There's a public health thing in there, which I would say I think the courts have recognised stealthing, thanks to sex workers who have complained about condoms being removed and sex occurring after the fact. And so the courts have recognised that. But the potential exists for sex workers, clients and operators of brothels to be charged and convicted of not using or taking all reasonable steps to use a condom. Now, while some people might think, oh, that's good, that's sensible, well, that should be under occupational safety and health, health and safety legislation. It shouldn't be in the potential for any sex worker to be convicted. That's really wrong. So we've never liked that. That was something that was attached as it went through this select committee process. And some sex workers on the ground say, oh no, it's great, because I can just say, if you don't wear a condom, I'm in trouble. And you're in trouble too, But public health, that's not good public health strategy.
Absolutely. And do you feel like you guys are making good progress on removing those sections?
I think the court has, definitely, like the removal of condoms, so a sex worker might have a removal of condoms and then, clearly it's a sexual assault.
Yes.
If sex occurs, it's without consent unless a condom was used. So the courts have recognised that, and so have the police. They've clearly supported sex workers to take that through and elevate it into a sexual assault scenario, which is really important. So we're pleased about this.
Yeah. On the other section, much progress?
Oh, well, I think at the moment the Ministry of Justice is looking at prioritising where Section 19 should fit. The UN Committee to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women sent a report to say that they need to amend that piece in the legislation, the government. And of course Pandora Black took a petition, and so the Select Committee, the Petitions Committee, referred it to the Work and something rather committee, who came out with a report to say government certainly needs to look at this. So it was kind of a parallel response to what CEDAW had recommended.
So definitely some moves being made in the right direction.
A little bit. It feels a bit like the Select Committee bounced it back to government, departments, ministries, and I think it should have stayed in the political sphere. They should have bloody well dealt with it.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you feel receiving a damehood for all that you've done in the community? What was that like?
Well, it was a deep shock. I mean, clearly you were approached at the time and people asked if you'd be accepting of a nomination for some award, and there's that. But that's a very high honour, and I thought, oh gosh, that's it's kind of weird, because on the one hand, historically it was the Crown that was against us, and then here we had this other thing happen.
It's sort of a move that they're recognising you finally.
I think so. I mean, I certainly had people who said, oh, how can you accept it? Because this is people inside the sex worker rights movement, because you're colluding with the Crown and the oppressor. It's sort of, but I think overall, it marked a shift in perception of sex workers. I think it was useful. Yeah. When you've got people calling from Fox News, when Fox News in the States covered it, they said, oh, people in New Zealand are sick. This woman's been given damehood. She was a prostitute. And they must be sick.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Yeah. So overall, would you say you were pleased with your work? I mean, obviously you're still involved, but looking back, you'd say you're pleased with your work from your time.
I am pleased. I'd like to see. I definitely want to see that repeal of that piece. Go, the anti-migrant thing. It doesn't reflect our history. It doesn't reflect our ideological approach. Our history with migrant communities has been long and strong. Yes, absolutely. So it's offensive.
Do you have a career high?
Oh, I think I think sitting pitched in the gallery that night in Parliament was a career high, and realising that we won, that law had passed. I mean, that was a moment, and I think also I was invited to participate in a debate in the UK called the Oxford Union debate, and that was a moment, and certainly the Dame. But you come to an event like this and people are sitting around up there talking about decolonising sex work spaces, and I think it's fantastic, and they're here, they're in person. Yeah. They're all talking freely. Freely. Yeah.
It's really good. What about? Is there anything you wish you'd done differently or pushed a bit harder on this or not on this, you know?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't have taken as much time. We thought, you know, at first we were quite polite. We thought it would change at midnight. You know, there would be this kind of benign political environment that would really hear us,
Yeah.
understand, and you know, change the law. But yeah, I think that appreciation of the process of legislative reform wasn't there. We had support in a way where people would see you in passing and say, if you need help to write a submission, let us know. We've just done homosexual law reform. You know, but it wasn't easy. You know, you had to knock on people's doors, ring them up, make appointments. You know, now you just fire off a WhatsApp. Or, you know, organising is in comparison, I think it's still hard, but it's still. That back then it was like people said, have you got pictures of you out protesting? We didn't take it to the streets. We, you know, we could have, but people were scared about outing all of that.
Looking at the collective in the industry now, what would you say like the role of the younger generations are? Because I mean, I would imagine that they're sort of at the coalface, like pushing for change. Yeah.
Oh, I think so. I think, you know, the sophisticated, you know, the just you know, the binary gender stuff that, you know, he, she. I mean, all of that landscape is so important, incredibly well articulated. Like we've always had gender diverse, and whakawahine, for example, have been a huge part of our organisation. We've had non-binary, you know, it's nothing for us in the last 30 years. I was longer actually. I remember thinking our organisation was the biggest employer of people who are trans.
Wow, okay.
Isn't that shocking?
Yeah.
You know, a little humble community group. But that's not the case any longer.
Yeah.
So great stuff happening on that front. And I think it's hard to say. I mean, it's interesting watching the Fired Up Stilettos stripper group who are pushing for change in terms of contract law and, you know, want to have a prescribed amount of money in terms of a percentage, you know, that would be theirs. You know, they want to have different stuff. So it's kind of interesting watching complementary movements. Yeah. All driven by, you know, people who are very young.
I mean, Fired Up Stilettos, they're a contract issue. That's their name. They're fighting for better contracts and to be treated as employee. Well, they're currently being treated more like an employee than a contractor, but they are contractors. So is that sort of a similar arrangement legally that sex workers have?
That's right.
Yeah.
And oddly, you know, there's a point in time where we saw IRD as our closest ally in terms of addressing exploitation really quickly, because you don't want to be fingered as an employer by IRD.
Right, yeah.
If you haven't been as such, you know, if you haven't been paying attention. So you need to respect the space in between being a contractor, independent contractor, and subcontractor, and all those sorts of relationships that have tax implications.
Absolutely. With Fired Up Stilettos again, I mean, is it weird for you? Is it positive for you to see that like they're taking it right to the steps of Parliament? You know.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's fantastic. You know, they're doing good old-fashioned advocacy in a public space with such humour and light and fun.
Yeah.
And you know, it's not a new model in terms of, you know, it's what sex worker activism looks like when you look outside and you look around. But it doesn't reflect where we were. I used to say, well, we're going to keep our elbows on the table and, you know, do that kind of serious stuff. But it's not to say it's not effective. It's really effective. It's caught the public imagination, and people, you know, can talk about it, and they're able to control their media as well, which is really good.
Mm-hmm. Just switching tack a little, I want to just talk a bit more generally for a moment. I mean, there's a lot of really pressing issues that face the world and future generations at the moment, like, you know, climate crisis, housing crisis, inequality. There's too many to name. What would you say, going forward, do you think our biggest threat is in New Zealand and globally?
In that context of sex worker rights?
Absolutely, or just in generally.
Right, I think equity is huge, and you know, this blind spot people have in relation to equity, and in terms of our context, you know, the privileged few of us who are out and able to be and cross borders and, you know, expect a roof over our heads. Sex workers fun, you know, that kind of anthem, and it's not necessarily fun. It's you know, it can be a lot of things to a lot of people, and but I do think equity, you know, the divide that's there so clearly, you know, and it's there in a micro way and a macro way. Poverty, equity.
When you first when you first started sex work, you were fairly young in the collective, obviously, and I imagine the younger generations coming through now, you're involved with them quite a bit. I mean, they're upstairs right now. Do you have faith in today's young people to sort of take up the mantle, you know, within the sex industry, and, you know, just in general, you know, take up the mantle from the powers that be now and keep fighting?
Oh yes, I think there's no such thing as mentoring the young are mentoring us. We're learning, it's an exchange, and you know, I think the navigation, yes, we all can do with a bit of, okay, maybe that direction, not that direction, but you know, each the period in time, you know, there are big waves, and there's a big wave, I think, that's happening now, and you know, it happens in the context of climate change, and you know, the debates about the haves and have-nots. That's old. That's an old historical thing, and feminism, radical feminism, all of that stuff. You know, the gender issues are really riding high, and which is great. And look, you know, like, people may not feel that things have changed if they're in some of those spaces where they have less than. But you know, for me, reflecting as a 67-year-old looking back, I think it's. Sometimes I think, oh yes, well, I lived through the 70s. I don't want to live through them again.
Yeah.
We were, you know, we weren't quite that conservative. We were, you know, we were there too. We knew enough.
Yeah, I mean, it was great to hear that trans and non-binary people are such a big and recognised part of the industry, especially with all the culture wars going on at the moment about that. What would you say to young people who are wanting to make a change in the world? You know, what advice would you give them?
Yes, in terms of sex worker stuff, you know, like, it's horrible advice, because you have to sort of say, be aware, there's face recognition, you know, there could be a consequence here, just be aware of it, and you can't be aware of how things are going to play out. You know, that you might have your life reduced because you're a public figure going out, hard out with activism, when a lot of the world is shutting its doors on realising rights for sex workers, and, you know, stopping people from travelling to their countries, and so on. So just you have to be circumspect with a measure of circumspection, but don't lose all the flavour.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't lose all hope.
No.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Dame Catherine. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. And Namahi, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next episode.